The jungle was alive with whispers of death. August 19th, 1942, Guadalcanal, an island that would soon become a name carved into the very bones of the Pacific War. Beneath a canopy so thick it devoured the light, Colonel Keonao Ichiki's men moved through choking vines and stifling humidity, unaware that the myth of Japan's invincibility was about to die beside them. They had come ashore at night, believing the task simple: crush a small band of Americans who dared occupy this forgotten corner of the Solomon Islands. Tokyo had told them it would be easy. The Americans were soft, untested, unfit for real war. They would flee before dawn. But as Ichiki's men advanced, the jungle itself seemed to hum with something unseen, a presence watching, waiting. In the darkness ahead lay 11,000 Marines of the 1st Marine Division, battle-hardened, undersupplied, and determined to hold Henderson Field, the airstrip that would become the key to everything. Operation Watchtower had begun only 12 days earlier, the first American offensive of the Pacific War. Its goal was deceptively small: seize the unfinished Japanese airfield, secure a perimeter, and survive. Yet this patch of swamp and coral would ignite a struggle that changed the tide of history. The men who landed at Lunga Point found an island that hated them. 90 miles long, 25 wide, cloaked in jungle and heat thick enough to drown in. Clouds hung low over mountains that cut the horizon in jagged black teeth. The air reeked of rot and fear. Mosquitoes swarmed so dense that men inhaled them when they breathed. Water shimmered invitingly, but every stream crawled with parasites. The Marines built their foxholes beside rotting trees, their sweat mixing with volcanic mud, their nerves stretched tight as piano wire. Yet even here, amid disease and isolation, they worked. Within days they'd taken the airfield, renamed it Henderson Field, and brought in planes to form what history would call the Cactus Air Force. From this single strip of earth, the balance of the Pacific began to shift. For Japan, this was intolerable. Henderson Field gave the Americans control of the sea during daylight. Its fighters could strike any Japanese ship within 200 miles. Without it, the enemy could move freely. With it, Japan's advance in the South Pacific would grind to a halt. Orders went out from Rabaul: destroy the invaders, retake the airfield at once. The task fell to the 17th Army under Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, and from that command to one man, Colonel Ichiki, a proud officer from the elite 28th Infantry Regiment. He had been an instructor, a perfectionist, a believer in the moral supremacy of Japanese fighting spirit. He was also reckless. His orders were to wait for the rest of his regiment before attacking. He did not. To Ichiki, delay was cowardice. He had fought Americans before, or so he thought. Weak men behind big guns, quick to break, soft of will. He would strike fast, crush them, and send their bodies into the sea. On the night of August 18th, 6 destroyers slid through the black water and deposited 917 men near Taivu Point. The landing was perfect. The Americans did not stir. In the thick jungle, Ichiki's troops assembled, confident, ready to erase the humiliation of seeing foreign soldiers on what they considered Japanese soil. But confidence would soon curdle into horror. At dawn, a Marine patrol stumbled upon Japanese scouts near the Ilu River. Gunfire cracked through the palms. 31 Japanese soldiers fell. The rest vanished into the undergrowth. The Americans found maps, plans, documents, proof that a major assault was coming. General Alexander Vandergrift, the quiet, methodical commander of the Marine Division, read the captured papers and understood immediately. The Japanese would attack soon, and in force. He ordered his men to prepare. Along the riverbank they dug in, machine guns overlapping, artillery zeroed on the sandbar. The trap was set. Ichiki never knew. He moved his troops through the night, convinced that the enemy ahead was in retreat. Just after midnight his men crossed the sandbar screaming war cries, bayonets flashing under the moonlight. They charged straight into hell. The first bursts from the Marine Browning machine guns tore through them like invisible scythes. The river turned black with blood. Wave after wave surged forward, only to be shredded by canister fire from 37mm guns that spat storms of steel. Men fell in heaps, bodies piling faster than the current could carry them away. Still they came, stepping over the dead, howling, firing blindly into the dark. The air reeked of gunpowder, blood, and burning flesh. The Americans did not move, did not panic, did not yield. They waited, reloaded, fired. Again. When dawn came, the sandbar was carpeted with corpses. The cries of the dying faded into the buzz of flies. The first Japanese assault on Guadalcanal had been annihilated. Over 800 of Ichiki's men lay dead. The Marines lost fewer than 50. By noon, American tanks had rolled across the sandbar, crushing any resistance that remained. Ichiki, realizing his failure, burned his regimental colours and shot himself. What was supposed to be a swift victory had turned into an unthinkable catastrophe. For the first time in modern history, a Japanese regiment had been wiped out to the last man. The Imperial Army, undefeated for 5 years, had met an enemy who did not break. Word of the disaster reached Rabaul within days. Tokyo refused to believe it. Reports spoke of a misunderstanding, of exaggeration, of an unfortunate setback. But the truth could not be denied. The Americans had held, and the Japanese had bled. For the men still on the island, the nightmare was only beginning. The Tokyo Express, nightly destroyer runs carrying reinforcements and supplies, began immediately. They were fast, precise, and lethal under cover of darkness, but the ships could carry little. Men arrived by the thousands, but heavy equipment, food, and medicine did not. The jungle became both enemy and tomb. As September approached, new Japanese troops gathered near the same place where Ichiki had died, waiting for their chance to avenge him. They would find instead the same guns, the same mud, and the same unyielding wall of fire. Guadalcanal had become a crucible, and before the campaign was done it would consume them all. The jungle never slept. After the slaughter on the Tenaru, the island seemed to breathe with ghosts. For the Americans, victory brought no celebration, only the grim certainty that more were coming. For the Japanese High Command, Ichiki's death was not a defeat to be mourned, but a challenge to erase. Reinforcements would land, and Guadalcanal would be retaken, no matter the cost. In late August, destroyers began racing down from the northern Solomons, sleek and fast as sharks. These nighttime supply missions, soon called the Tokyo Express, slipped through darkness under cover of rain and moonless skies. They brought men in waves, but almost nothing else. No heavy guns, no food, no medicine, just soldiers and rifles. By the first days of September, nearly 5,000 more Japanese troops stood on the beaches east of the American perimeter, led by Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, a veteran of China who believed his men's spirit could overcome any obstacle. He studied the maps, saw the ridges rising behind Henderson Field, and smiled. "We will attack from the jungle," he said. "The enemy will not expect it." He was wrong. The Marines had learned quickly. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt, Red Mike Edson, commander of the Raider Battalion, was already watching those same ridges. A reconnaissance raid had revealed supply dumps and movement, signs of a massing force. Edson understood what was coming. He moved his raiders and the battered paratroopers of the 1st Battalion onto a narrow coral spine south of the airfield, a ridge barely 1,000 meters long. To the untrained eye, it was just another patch of jungle, but Edson saw something else, the key to the island. If that ridge fell, Henderson Field would be lost. He turned it into a fortress. Machine guns were sighted to interlock their fire. Mortar crews measured distance to the last meter. Artillery from the 11th Marines zeroed in on every approach route. They built a web of destruction so dense that any attacker would have to walk through fire to reach them. The Japanese came at night, as always. September 12th, rain falling like liquid steel. The first whispers of movement drifted through the dark, then gunfire erupted from the ravines. Kawaguchi's men advanced in 3 directions, slipping through mud and tangled roots, guided by the faint glow of flares. They believed surprise was theirs. Instead, they walked into death. Machine guns opened like thunder, cutting swaths through the jungle. Mortars rained high explosives that burst among the trees, turning branches into spears. Men screamed, vanished, reappeared as shadows lit by the flash of explosions. The fighting was close, brutal, and endless. Marines fired until their weapons steamed in the rain, then grabbed pistols, knives, even entrenching tools. In some places, the Japanese broke through, only to be driven back by counterattacks led by Edson himself, who moved along the line shouting, "Hold your ground, boys! Hold this ridge or we die here!" All through the night, the battle raged across the slopes. Flares rose, painting the ridge in white fire, and every time one burned out, darkness swallowed the world again. At one machine gun position, Sergeant John Basilone kept firing long after his crew was dead or wounded, changing barrels with blistered hands, his body covered in mud and blood. The dead piled so thick around his gun that he had to kick them aside to keep firing. When his ammunition ran out, he crawled through enemy fire to bring more alone, refusing to abandon his post. His actions that night would later earn him the Medal of Honor, but in the moment, he was just one man trying to survive. By dawn on September the 13th, the ridge was a graveyard. Hundreds of Japanese bodies lay twisted among the kunai grass, but the enemy was not done. Kawaguchi, furious that his first attack had failed, regrouped his men for another assault. That night the second wave came. Larger, louder, desperate. The Japanese charged uphill again, screaming their battle cries, hurling grenades, bayonets glinting in the flash of gunfire. Some reached the crest, slashing at Marines in hand-to-hand combat before being cut down. The defenders fell back a few yards, reformed and held. The entire ridge seemed to shake with the force of combat. Edson fought in the open, his face streaked with dirt and exhaustion, rallying men who could barely stand. "This is it, boys," he shouted. "This is our hill." No one passes us tonight. Artillery from Henderson Field thundered into the jungle, shells landing so close that shrapnel sliced through Marine lines. The air was thick with smoke, screams, and the dull roar of automatic fire. For hours the outcome hung in balance. When the sun finally rose on September 14th, it revealed a slaughter. Over 800 Japanese soldiers were dead. The ridge was still in American hands. The Marines had lost 100 men killed and twice that wounded, but they had held the heart of Guadalcanal. Kawaguchi's dream of retaking the airfield had dissolved into ash. For Japan, Bloody Ridge, Edson's Ridge as the Marines would call it, was more than a defeat. It was a revelation. The enemy they had dismissed as weak had fought with method, patience, and precision. The Americans did not rely on bravery alone. They built systems, networks of firepower that made courage lethal. Kawaguchi's survivors stumbled back into the jungle, half-starved, carrying their wounded on bamboo poles. The rain returned, washing the blood into the soil. The ridge would remain quiet for weeks, but the war on Guadalcanal was far from over. In the days that followed, the jungle itself became the primary enemy. Men on both sides fought not only the other army, but nature itself. Malaria spread like wildfire. Skin infections turned to open sores. Leeches filled boots and helmets. The smell of decay never left the air. By October, nearly every Marine had been sick at least once, many reduced to shadows of themselves. Yet American logistics, barely functional at first, slowly improved. Cargo ships arrived under air cover, field hospitals expanded, ammunition and rations flowed ashore. The Americans suffered, but they endured. The Japanese suffered and withered. The Tokyo Express could deliver men, but not sustenance. Soldiers learned to stretch one rice ball across an entire day. Water came from streams laced with disease. They boiled it when they could, drank it filthy when they couldn't. Quinine ran out. Bandages were reused until they rotted. Doctors amputated limbs without anaesthetic. Some soldiers, too weak to stand, clutched grenades to their chests when the fever took them. Yet still they obeyed their orders. Still they prepared to attack again. In Tokyo, the generals could not comprehend the magnitude of the failure. They believed that determination would compensate for hunger, that courage would replace bullets. On Guadalcanal, courage was everywhere, and it was dying. By late October 1942, the jungle had devoured the island. Men no longer looked like soldiers, but phantoms, hollow-eyed, their uniforms in rags, their skin burned and bitten raw. For General Harakichi Hyakutake, now personally directing the 17th Army on Guadalcanal, the situation was collapsing faster than any report dared admit. Yet Tokyo demanded victory. The Emperor's army could not abandon the airfield that had become the beating heart of the Pacific. And so, another offensive was planned, larger, coordinated, decisive. It would be Japan's final attempt to crush the Americans and retake Henderson Field. For the soldiers who received the orders, it was not a plan. It was a death sentence. On October 23rd, the offensive began. From the west, 9 light tanks rolled forward across the Matanikau River, their engines choking in mud. Behind them came hundreds of infantrymen carrying rifles worn smooth by tropical rain. Across the river, Marines waited. Anti-tank guns fired once, twice, 9 times. The Japanese armour burst into flames one by one. Burning fuel rolled down the slopes like rivers of fire. The infantry behind them hesitated, then broke. Within minutes the Western attack was gone, swallowed by smoke and screams. But that was only the beginning. Hyakutake's main force, nearly 6,000 strong under Major General Yumio Nasu, advanced through the jungle from the south. They would strike the Americans' weakest point, or so they believed. In truth, they were walking straight toward the men who had turned Edson's Ridge into legend. Among them was Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, his jaw set, his eyes burning beneath his helmet brim. He commanded the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, now reinforced by fresh soldiers from the US Army's 164th Infantry. These men had been fighting, sick and starving for months, but they knew the ground, and they had dug in deep. The jungle was so dense that daylight vanished by noon. Rain fell constantly, thunder rolling over the ridge like artillery. Puller's men built overlapping fields of fire and waited. On the night of October 24th, the first assault came. It began with eerie silence, then the sound of branches snapping, a low chant, and suddenly the night exploded. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers burst through the foliage, bayonets flashing, shouting, "Banzai!" Machine guns answered with a wall of sound. Muzzle flashes lit the jungle like lightning. Basilone was there again, his hands raw, feeding belts of ammunition into red-hot guns as his section held the centre. When their weapons jammed, he cleared them under fire. When barrels melted, he replaced them with his bare hands. When men fell, he fought alone. The Japanese came in waves, 3, then 5, then 7, but none broke through. Puller called in artillery so close that shrapnel shredded his own perimeter. Marines fought hand-to-hand, bayonets and fists and knives, until the ground itself seemed to move beneath the weight of bodies. By dawn the jungle was silent again except for the moans of the dying. Nasu was dead, shot through the chest while rallying his troops. 2,000 Japanese lay scattered across the mud. The survivors crawled away, dragging themselves through the undergrowth. The air smelled of smoke, blood, and decay. The Americans had held once more. For the first time, the Imperial Army faced something it could not defeat. An enemy that fought with patience, precision, and endless firepower. But victory had its own price. Guadalcanal was not a triumph. It was a slow murder of every living thing. The Marines were skeletal, hollowed by malaria and dysentery. Yet compared to the Japanese, they were lucky. American supply lines, now protected by Henderson Field's aircraft and the Navy offshore, brought food, medicine, and ammunition. The Tokyo Express brought only death. Japanese soldiers ate anything: grass, roots, insects, even leather. Men too weak to walk were left behind with grenades clutched to their chests. Medical officers recorded over half their units dying not from bullets, but from starvation. The jungle became a grave without markers. When they could, they burned their dead to keep the stench from driving them mad. When they couldn't, they left the bodies to rot in the rain. Every sunrise was a reminder that the Empire was dying on this cursed island. In November, the war shifted the seas. The Japanese launched one last massive naval effort to bombard Henderson Field and deliver reinforcements. The battle for Guadalcanal at sea would become one of the most ferocious surface engagements in history. On the night of November 13th, under a black sky lit only by tracer fire, American and Japanese ships collided in chaos. The battleships Hiei and Kirishima roared against the cruisers San Francisco and Portland at point-blank range. Shells tore through hulls. Men were blown into the sea, burning alive. When dawn came, both fleets were shattered. The Americans had lost cruisers and destroyers, their decks slick with oil and blood. But Henderson Field still stood. 2 nights later, the USS Washington found the Kirishima in the dark. Using radar fire control, she opened up with her 16-inch guns. 9 shells tore through the Japanese battleship in minutes. Kirishima sank, taking hundreds of sailors with her. The final attempt to bombard the airfield had failed. For the soldiers still fighting on land, the sea battles meant one thing: the end. The convoys that had carried hope were gone. The supply lines were broken. On land, Hyakutaka's forces dwindled to shadows. Out of 36,000 Japanese who had come to Guadalcanal, barely a third still lived, and half of those could no longer fight. By December, the decision was made in secret. Evacuation. The word itself was forbidden. Officially, it was called a change of deployment. In truth, it was surrender disguised as strategy. Operation K would be the final act. Using the same destroyers that had brought them here, the Japanese would extract what was left of their army under the cover of darkness. The first run came on February 1st, 1943. The last ended on the night of February 7th. In 3 nights, they pulled out just over 10,000 men, half dead, skeletal, crawling onto decks too weak to stand. They left behind 30,000 bodies and the myth of an empire that could never lose. When the Americans realized the island was empty, they did not cheer. They were too tired, too broken, too changed. The men who had arrived in August as soldiers left in February as ghosts of themselves. They had survived malaria, starvation, and an enemy that refused to die. They had fought not just a battle, but the birth of a new kind of war. Industrial, relentless, defined by firepower and logistics rather than courage alone. Guadalcanal had rewritten the rules. For Japan, it was the beginning of the end. For America, it was the proof of concept. The arsenal of democracy could fight, adapt, and win. The campaign had lasted 6 months, cost more than 7,000 American lives, and annihilated over 30,000 Japanese. Yet the numbers only hinted at the scale of transformation. Every battle that followed, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, was born here, in the mud and heat of Guadalcanal. The lessons carved into that island were brutal. Courage without supply meant nothing. Spirit without coordination meant death. The Japanese had fought with extraordinary bravery, but they had waged a war their nation could not sustain. They learned too late that the enemy they called soft was made of steel. And so the jungle of Guadalcanal became both tomb and teacher. For the Americans who lived, it was where innocence ended. They had faced hunger, exhaustion, and horror, yet they had learned that even in the darkest places, discipline and unity could hold the line. For the Japanese who escaped, it was the place where belief shattered, the moment they understood that the Empire's victories had been built on illusion. Courage could not feed an army, sacrifice could not stop bullets, and the divine wind would never blow strong enough to turn the tide. When the war finally ended 3 years later, veterans on both sides would look back and know it all began here. Guadalcanal was not merely a battle, it was the crucible of the Pacific, the place where the world learned what total war truly meant. And for those who fought there, it would never end. It lived in their dreams, in the smell of rain on jungle soil, in the sound of flies over forgotten graves. It was the place where courage met reality, and reality won.